Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski with the Cipher Brief. Delighted to be joined today by Kurt Volker, Cipher Brief expert, former ambassador to NATO, among other things, for the United States. And we're here to talk about a possible endgame for the war in Ukraine. It's in the conversation now, in part because President-elect Trump's uh, envoy for Russia and Ukraine, retired General Keith Kellogg, has said now that he's going to pursue a plan to end the war in the next 100 days, or 100 days from the inauguration. And we've heard a lot of interesting new elements that might go into this approach, everything from heightened U.S. oil and gas production to perhaps the insertion of peacekeepers to greater willingness to engage with the Kremlin, if not Mr. Putin directly. But Kurt, let me ask you, as you read the tea leaves, and you may have more tea leaves than the rest of us as to what lies ahead. What are the things that we should pay most attention to in terms of this new approach that we might see unfold in the next 100 days?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Tom. And it's great to be with you in the Cipher Brief. First off, I think what's significant about General Kellogg saying 100 days is that it's not one day. You'll remember that President Trump, during the course of the presidential campaign, repeatedly said he would end the war in a day. I think that President Trump and General Kellogg all realize that this is much more difficult than that. The issue is getting Putin to agree to stop the war. Getting Ukraine to negotiate, getting Ukraine to find a reasonable position here is not difficult. They're ready to do that. It is Putin who wants to take over and eliminate Ukraine as a separate national identity, and getting him to give up on that goal. That's the tough part. And that's why I think 100 days here is significant. As to what that entails, I think you have to look to President Zelensky's interview with Sky News that he did right before Christmas. And this basically laid out what I think are indeed the key elements. One is a ceasefire. Two is a non-recognition of Russia's occupation of parts of Ukrainian territory, including Donbass, including Crimea, including territories he's taken since 2022. So a non-recognition of that, but an acknowledgement by Ukraine that they're not going to take this back by military means. It's going to be a long-term dispute, and they'll seek to get it back by diplomatic, political, and other means. And then finally, genuine, meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, so that Putin is deterred from ever attacking again. Those seem to me to be the key elements. Now, the Trump team, I don't think, has had the opportunity to really think all this through, to really put together concrete plans. General Kellogg was hoping to visit Ukraine and some European capitals before inauguration. He's had to postpone that trip until after inauguration. So I think it is going to take a little bit of time. And then the final point, and you raised this in your question, is energy and what means do we have to put pressure on Russia to come to a negotiating table and to agree to some kind of settlement. And here I do believe energy is one of the key issues. First off, increased U.S. oil and gas production and export can have an impact on global prices, driving them down. That will impact Putin's war budget right off the top. Second, we'll have the opportunity then to enforce sanctions that are currently on the books that would inhibit Russia's oil and gas exports and revenue generation. The Biden administration put a lot on the table in terms of Russia's energy and finances for sanctions, but then there was not much follow through when it came to secondary sanctions, when it came to the financial transactions that related to energy. Those were exempted from sanctions. So closing a lot of these loopholes is now possible. And I think both of these will have a significant impact on Russia's finances.
Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued by one element of the many things you put on the table there, Ambassador Volker, which is this phrase non-recognition of the territory that the Russians have taken. So is this essentially a kind of compromise where, as you said, the Ukrainians would accept that they can't right now anyway retake those lands by force? We're talking about nearly a fifth of the country, I think. But no, it becomes sort of like a Cyprus or something in terms of I can't think of another example, but I'm sure there are many of just global territory that will sit there with in dispute for some time to come.
Yeah, exactly. The best example is East Germany. You'll remember that at the end of World War II, the Allied powers occupied Western Germany and West Berlin, and Russia, or the Soviet Union, occupied East Germany. And while it was always in the German constitution that there would be a unification of all German lands, it was accepted that it was not going to be done militarily. And indeed, East Germany existed as an independent state more than anyone is suggesting for Eastern Ukraine. But East Germany existed as an independent
Right.
state for 40 years before Germany was unified again.
Right.
Another parallel is the Baltic states. The Soviet Union occupied Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania at the outset of World War II, and then kept those countries even after World War II. The United States, through the Wells Declaration of 1940, put out I believe it was 1940, put out a statement that said we do not and will not recognize the forcible incorporation of the territories of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. And we maintained that policy throughout the
Right.
Cold War. And sure enough, those countries got their independence back in 1991. So I think we're looking at a scenario.
50 years in that case, right?
Yeah, it took a long time,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
maintained a position of principle.
Yeah.
It was not a war to get those countries back or to unify East Germany and West Germany. It was patience and persistence around this idea of non-recognition.
Right. And so, of course, for Ukraine, it might take a very long time. Great. I appreciate the clarification. I wonder if you could step back for a moment. It's widely, I think, in the media at least, accepted that that Ukraine's had a rough go lately. They've been losing territory, not at a very fast rate in the east. That they've had manpower issues, all the rest, and that they would come to a negotiation right now in a very tough position. I've heard a lot of pushback on that. I wonder if you could assess where you think, let's say day one of this is next week sometime. What sort of state does Ukraine come to the table, or what kind of leverage or positioning do you think they have right now?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. And as far as the things you mentioned, they are true. Russia has made steady incremental gains in the East over the second half of 2024 and even into the current day. They have done that. It has not been a lot of land. We're talking about 4,000 plus square kilometers, and that is at the
Right.
cost of about 400,000 casualties. So tremendous human cost for Russia to get relatively little. But they are making those incremental gains. And you're also right, Ukraine is having issues with manpower. They have had issues with the supply of weapons from the US and other countries. And we know that our industrial capacity is limited, so there isn't that much out there ready to be given. We have to keep producing it. And Ukraine is, in fact, dependent upon the supply of Western weapons. They're doing more and more on their own, especially in the unmanned areas, so producing drones and sending them long range, producing their own rocket that can go long range. So they're doing better on their own, but they still need Western supplies. So they are dependent in that way going into any kind of negotiation. But we also have to remember that Russia's in a
And
weakened
then
position too.
it was going to be my next question that to take it from the Kremlin view, and I appreciate you're not in Kiev and you're not in Moscow, but to yes, the same question from the standpoint of the Kremlin, and I guess you started to answer it, which is they're not exactly in the driver's seat either. Is that right?
That's right. They have high inflation. Estimates are all over the place. I would estimate it to be around 30%, but official estimates are closer to 8 or 9. But we do know that interest rates in Russia are fixed at 21% right now. So we have to assume that inflation is above that, and this is an aim to try to squeeze down inflation. But the problem is that Russia doesn't have access to foreign exchange reserves of any great quantity. Their external assets have been frozen. They can't get new foreign exchange reserves. So they're drawing down what they've got. And this is causing them budgetary pressures. And so they're having to print rubles, which, of course, printing rubles is, again, just fueling inflation. Also fueling inflation is a labor shortage because they've pressed so many people
Right.
into the conflict in Ukraine that they don't have the labor force at home to staff out the economy as well as the defense industries that they need. That's just on the economic side. On the military side, they also have a manpower problem. They have been losing people on the battlefield at such a rate that they can't replace them at that speed. So we're talking 1,500 people a day. They're not recruiting at that rate. That means that they are working with units that have holes in them. They've brought in North Korean troops who are not as effective. They have struggled with how to keep up the tempo while facing a manpower shortage. And then you have the equipment situation. They
Right.
can't produce defense equipment at the rate that they are burning through that either. Therefore, they're relying on North Korea for artillery shells. They are relying on Iran for drones. They are taking World War II era equipment out of storage and trying to use that. So Russia is having a very difficult time as well. And we see this in two things that happened recently. One of them is their inability to oust Ukraine from Russian territory in Kursk. They were invaded by Ukraine as a pushback against Russia's invasions of Ukraine, and they haven't been able to dislodge the Ukrainians. The second element is their inability to maintain enough force in Syria to prevent the fall of the Assad regime. They had whittled it down so much that the Assad regime just collapsed, and now Russia has faced a growing uncertainty, really, about their presence in the Middle East, and they've had to draw down forces from Syria even further than they had until now. So there's a lot of weakness on the Russian side as they go into this as well.
So two last questions, Ambassador Volker, if I could, about this 100-day thing. First of all, the notion of greater engagement with the Kremlin, not to put you too much on the spot, but would you advise, or do you think that that's going to mean, we know President-elect Trump has a predilection for, personal diplomacy, shall we say? He did it in his first term with the North Koreans and others. Do you think it would be a good idea for him to meet with Vladimir Putin? We know a lot of Western leaders, including President Biden, were not going to do that, or not. Or do you have an opinion?
Yeah. Well, my view is that he should call Putin, as he said he would do, and tell Putin to stop the war. And he should offer a meeting with Putin after the war is over. So not before, not as a way of getting there. That would show weakness and Trump being a supplicant, and Trump doesn't want to be in that position. But to offer that he's willing to meet with Putin, but after Putin stops the war, I think that would be reasonable.
And then last question, we've already seen in the run-up to January 20th, both sides, understandably, I suppose, pushing for leverage, particularly on the battlefield. You mentioned Kursk, eastern Ukraine, I guess gunning for as much as they can get before a negotiation begins. Is there any danger, do you think, in putting out, okay, we're going for 100 days here, that now becomes oh boy, we better get our folks on the battlefield to push even more ferociously and violently for gains before they actually have to meet this deadline?
Yeah. Well, it's a reasonable point, and I can see how you could say that putting a deadline out there creates that. In a way, though, I think we've already faced that. I think with Trump's victory in the election, we've already seen an escalation by Russia in order to try to shore up its position ahead of Trump coming into office. And it's not as if Russia has a lot of reserves left over that it's been holding back. And now all of a sudden it's going to throw them on the table too. They've been going at this all out for almost 3 years now, and they're pretty much maxed out with what they can do. So it's a fair consideration, but I wouldn't put too much weight on it. And I do think that it is more useful in a way to give the parties, especially Russia, a sense that there is a deadline. And if they don't meet that deadline, if they don't just end the war, then there will be continued aid to Ukraine, maybe even an increase in the types, quality, and a lifting of restrictions on aid to Ukraine if Russia does not agree to end the war. And that brings up one point I wanted to make, Tom, which is when we talk about negotiations, a lot of people think that this might then be like the Dayton Accords and details and what about this settlement? What about that settlement? Should there be a referendum in some territories about what those people want? What about autonomy for certain regions? My advice to the Trump team would be don't fall for any of that. All those things are smokescreens. The Russians bring those up in order to
Hmm.
tie us into knots about how to deal with them. We shouldn't be engaging in those sorts of conversations. It should all be about just ending the fighting, ending the carnage, as President Trump likes to say. Just keep it simple, focus on ending that. If more pressure has to be applied to get Russia to do that, apply more pressure, but just end it. Don't worry about those minutiae.
It's a really good point, and we'll end it there. And from Ambassador Volker, who knows a thing or two about the Balkans and the Dayton Accords, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tom. Great to be with you.